Hi, my name is Will McCants. I direct the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world here at Brookings. Today we have a panel on the next generation of terrorism. We're joined by three panelists. To my left is Colonel Tracy Onifer, who's a military fellow at the Center for International and Strategic Studies, and she's with the United States Air Force. To her left is Colonel Kathy Turner, who's at the U.S. Army, who's a U.S. Army War College Fellow, and is at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And then to her left is Colonel Karen Meeker, who is a U.S. Army College Fellow at the Institute of World Politics, and she's with the United States Army. Okay, so we're going to start first with Colonel Onifer, and she is going to talk about her research on foreign fighters.
Yes. Thank you, Will. I appreciate the opportunity to be here at Brookings this morning to present. And it's also great to know that I'm sitting next to the expert, so if I say anything that's way off base, he can correct me. But just as a little background, prior to starting my fellowship at CSIS, I was a SOCOM liaison to the National Counterterrorism Center. And while there, I got to work whole of government foreign fighter policy for the foreign fighters who were traveling to Syria. As we were crafting the foreign fighter line of effort that's under the USG's counter-ISIL strategy, and I'm going to use ISIL, that's the government's preferred moniker, and that's what I'm used to saying. But I was struck by a comment that was made by one of our senior military leaders where he essentially said, "Foreign fighters aren't a new problem. I don't understand why this is so difficult." And in his mind, you know, with the U.S. government, we should have already had a standing plan to deal with foreign fighters because they were prevalent in Iraq, which is where he mostly dealt with them in the mid-2000s. But what he failed to recognize is that especially with this current wave that's going to Syria, we don't have a U.S. military presence, so it's really more of a law enforcement and border security problem. So his comment got me to thinking, what else is different about foreign fighters going to Syria, and how does this movement compare to previous foreign fighter movements? So for my research project, I'm doing basically a compare and contrast of four recent foreign fighter movements: Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Balkans in the 90s, Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s, and then currently Syria and Iraq from 2012 till now. For each wave, what I've looked at is the nature of the conflict, how many foreign fighters joined the conflict, why they were motivated to join the conflict, the types of communications that were used, how they were trained and utilized in the conflict, and how U.S. strategy and policy reacted, if at all. My overall argument is that foreign fighter movements, as they continue to evolve, our policy must continue to evolve as well. Essentially, the U.S. cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy for foreign fighters. So I have to caveat, I'm still about neck deep in the research, but I would like to offer some highlights I've noted along the way, along with some policy recommendations that I'm going to include in my conclusion. First, there are several different interpretations of the term foreign fighter. For the purpose of my research, I'm using essentially an amalgamation of descriptions offered by other researchers. And so my description is non-indigenous combatants motivated to enter a conflict zone to participate in hostilities due to a religious affinity with the Muslim side. So I'm specifically looking at the Muslim foreign fighter movements. Now, going back to Afghanistan in the 80s, this is what I've coined with respect to the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all. This foreign fighter movement is a direct ancestor to the future foreign fighter movements, and alumni from that campaign participated in insurgencies: Kashmir, Chechnya, Tajikistan, Algeria, the Balkans, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Egypt, among others. This movement spawned Al-Qaeda, the global foreign fighter phenomenon, and furthered the rise of radical Islam. But what surprised me about the foreign fighters in Afghanistan and doing the research is they really didn't make that much of a difference in the overall battle. They made up a very, very small percentage of the overall mujahideen, and there's a very wide range of estimates of how many participated. But in terms of those who actually were part of the conflict, who bared arms, it's about the 2,000 to 5,000 range. And those didn't even arrive in significant numbers until about 1986 or later. And when you consider that the conflict spanned from late 79 to early 89, they kind of were late to the game. Now, there were thousands of others who did travel, but they did not participate in the armed conflict. They were essentially the logistics, the behind support folks. And what was even more interesting is that by most accounts, there were more foreign fighters who traveled for Afghanistan for the period post-Soviet war or during the Afghanistan's internal strife period. Estimates of this time or this period are about 10 to 20,000 foreign fighters who traveled. But regardless of how many foreign fighters did or didn't contribute, this overall movement has left a legacy that we continue to battle today. So turning to the Balkans, several of the Afghanistan alumni traveled to Bosnia to open a new front in the global jihad. They were joined by Muslims from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, Iran, Europe, and North Africa. And estimates put them about in the 3,000 range for foreign fighters. And they fought alongside the Bosnian Muslims in the conflict. They even had their own Mujahideen battalion under the Bosnian army, which was mainly set up just so that the army could have some modicum of control over them. But there was a big difference between the foreign fighters who participated in this conflict versus the Muslims of Bosnia, in that the foreign fighters, their essential ultimate goal was martyrdom. That was their pinnacle of would mean that they had been successful, whereas the Bosnian Muslims just wanted to survive. So overall, the foreign fighters in Bosnia only made up about 1% of the fighting force. I'm going to skip Afghanistan from the 2000s and go straight to Iraq, where Sunni foreign fighters were drawn to Iraq as the new field of jihad in the battle against U.S. forces. Estimate for Iraq from about 2003 to 2011 is about 3,000 to 5,000 foreign fighters, which has been given an estimate somewhere within 4 to 10% of the overall number of insurgents who were fighting against the coalition. Now, what's notable about Iraq is that this is where foreign fighters significantly engaged the coalition with increasingly brutal tactics, suicide bombings, car bombs, improvised explosive devices, kidnappings, beheadings, complex attacks against hardened targets. This was also the first movement where the internet started to play a bigger role in how the foreign fighters and the insurgents communicated with each other. And then last, but certainly not least, we have the ongoing flow of foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq. I saw an article that was dated about a month and a half ago now, with estimates now in the 36,000 range for the total number who have traveled. Now, I do have to caveat that this also includes not just the fighters, but families, their wholesale uprooting and moving, and also other folks who are drawn to this notion of the utopian caliphate. And those 36,000 travelers represent about 120 countries now. This wave includes an unprecedented number from Western countries. The current estimates are about 6,600. And according to the FBI, about 250 Americans have either traveled or attempted to travel to Syria and Iraq. And stealing kind of a term and morphing it, I refer to this movement as the millennial jihadists. They're the first ones who have fully embraced the internet, secure telephone applications, and other technical advances that we have to get radicalized, to stay in touch, to get their way over, et cetera. Now, switching to some of the policy recommendations, there's 3 I'm going to highlight. First, I have to say I do not support a large ground contingent in Syria and Iraq to go against ISIL and the other radical Islamists there, just because we tried that in Afghanistan, we tried that in Iraq to start off with, and so far we haven't been very successful. But what I do feel is that we are not capitalizing enough on the battlefield successes that are happening. A few days ago, the Syrian Democratic Forces, supported by U.S. air power and special operations forces, took the town of Shadadi, Syria. If I'm saying that wrong, I apologize, from ISIL. And this is actually pretty key because this is on the route from Raqqa to Mosul is one of their key towns that they used for transporting supplies, et cetera. So this is actually going to complicate their ability, to move stuff in a more efficient manner. But unless you follow defense or foreign policy news outlets, this victory essentially went unnoticed. So in my mind, especially also what happened with Kobani last year, we need to highlight these more to negate ISIL's narrative of battlefield dominance. Similarly, I argue that we need to put more resources into amplifying moderate Islamic voices, as well as the stories and experiences of disillusioned former foreign fighters. The Grand Muftis of Saudi Arabia and Egypt have denounced ISIL, but this is not common knowledge. Well, at least it's not common knowledge against my friends and families when we've had this discussion, and they say, why aren't the Islamic leaders speaking out against ISIL? It's like, well, they are, but that's not what's selling newspapers and is getting on the front page. ISIL has an entire media wing with several branches, dedicated to disseminating their message and appealing to disaffected Muslims. If we're not willing to apply those same level of resources, it'll be impossible to counter their propaganda and ideology. And finally, this isn't a perfect world. If resources were unlimited, I'd like to see more efforts put into preventing violent extremism. There's currently a big emphasis on countering violent extremism, but in an ideal world, you wouldn't need to counter what you've already prevented. This would be a large undertaking, of course, requiring significant international support, because as noted by the United Nations, it would require, quote, systematic preventative steps to address the underlying conditions that drive individuals to radicalize and join violent extremist groups. I still have a ways to go on my research paper, but I appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of what I found so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Colonel Turner, who's going to talk about female suicide bombers.
Thank you, Will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about female suicide bombers and really discussing what draws women to join violent extremist groups, whether it's a violent extremist group, a revolutionary group, insurgencies. I'm not stuck on just a violent extremist group, just so everybody knows the context of what I looked at with my research. With instability in the world, it's increasing. Non-nation states are becoming more powerful. We need to recognize the role women are actively playing in terrorist organizations so we can better prepare ourselves. Throughout history, women have conducted violent acts, participating in violent extremist groups, insurgencies, and revolutionary organizations. So when I started my research, there's several examples I found. You have the Baader-Meinhof Brigade out of Germany, and that was a German militant group that attacked soldiers. It attacked 5th Corps headquarters in Germany, even went after, almost killed the U.S. Army Europe commander and his wife back in 1981. And we had heavy women were leaders in that organization. You look at the PKK, the IRA, ELN, the Sandinistas from the 1960s had 25 to 30% women in those organizations. Shining Path was another group that had 40% women in their organization. A famous women terrorist was Layla Khalid back in the 1970s, hijacked TWA Flight 840 in 1969. I mean, she was, they used her as an information operations campaign with putting her picture everywhere. So she was the picture of a female terrorist. Also had the Weather Underground here in the U.S., which was really a revolutionary youth movement in the 60s and 70s that eventually was using bombs to get their message across here in the United States. Why have we not recognized women's impact and the deadly effectiveness they have on security and society? Why don't we consider women a threat? So that's what my research really looked at. Most recently, when my article came out on female suicide bombers, it was I wrote it right before the Paris attacks. And I found that fascinating because the follow-up coverage to the Paris attacks focused on the female that everybody thought would detonate a suicide vest. And everybody started speculating, why did she do it? They were so fascinated that a female could be a suicide bomber. Why aren't we looking at the reason behind what made her do it instead of being fascinated that a female did it? If it was a man as a suicide bomber, we wouldn't have had all that coverage and that speculation. So I was really fascinated as to why, started to look behind that. Even with the San Bernardino attacks, Media reports were shocked at the woman's radicalization, and how could she, a mother, leave her child with family and then go do that terrorist attack? What about the male? What about the father? Why weren't we showing her picture actively as soon as the attacks happened? We were showing his picture, and she was blacked out. Why do we have that bias with women as terrorists? When we analyze women's motivations to join these groups, many analysts tend to believe women are coerced. They are victims of men rather than the possibility of an alternate explanation. There's really a more sophisticated, nuanced, complex set of factors to explain why women join these groups. And in my research, I took a look at Mia Bloom, who's a terrorist expert and a professor, at her methodology and her framework that she established to explain why women join these groups. She has a 4R+1, and I use that throughout my research. There's revenge, redemption, relationship, respect, and rape. And that's what I used as an analysis when I looked at my 3 case studies. And I looked at the Tamil Tigers, which is the LTTE out of Sri Lanka, the Chechen Black Widows, and the FARC out of Colombia. These 3 groups pioneered the tactics used that transcended their culture and used women as combatants to produce unexpected and often overwhelming results. The Tamil Tigers was a 26-year conflict in Sri Lanka. When you look at the LTTE, they had 30 to 40% women in their organization, and they perfected the use of the suicide vest. That's what they were known for, their use of the vest and the use of the suicide bomber. This was the only organization, the terrorist organization, to have killed 2 world leaders. One of the more known killings they did, or assassinations, was in 1991 with former Prime Minister Gandhi. He was killed by a 19-year-old suicide bomber. She made it through security. She got right up to him, and his security forces, one in particular was a woman that said, "Prime Minister, stop. Let's make sure she's okay." And his response, "She's okay. She's just a young girl." As soon as he touched her hand, she hit the detonation, and she killed him instantly. So, I mean, that's just a prime example of women getting through and being used as the advantage as a suicide bomber. The Chechen Black Widows, roughly about 40% of the organization were women. They focused on military targets, but then progressed to civilian targets, including children, and they really struck fear across Russia. I mean, even today, you see with the Olympics back in Russia in 2014, the possible threat of the Black Widows really terrified everybody to wonder, are the Olympics going to be safe? The FARC, 30 to 40% of the FARC were women. Sometimes, some estimates even believe up to 50% of the FARC were women because it was a 50-year conflict. And I chose the FARC because of the high percentage of women. They were the only group that I looked at that did not use suicide bombers, for women as a role in their organization. But I found the FARC fascinating because they treated women just like the men. They trained alongside the men, and they did everything that a man can do, and the FARC really capitalized on the use of women. And they're one of the few organizations that really had women in leadership roles. So even though the organizations I looked at actively used women, there are very few in leadership roles for some point or another based on the higher-up leadership that was in that organization. The Department of Defense and the U.S. government should view women within the context of conflict. We need to look at the threat women can pose and consider inclusive strategies that may be more effective during conflict prevention and post-conflict operations. Consider the current threats of Boko Haram and ISIL right now. As a military planner, I would want to know, how are the organizations using women? Not just the men. How are they using women? Why are they using women? What draws them to use women? What's the tactical and strategic advantage of them using women? Why are women joining these groups? And I'm saying joining. It's not, every woman does not get duped by a man to join a terrorist organization. There are some violent women out there, and they actively join these groups. How do we prevent women from engaging with these groups? What's the reason? How do we get into that prevention aspect? How do we get into that inclusive strategy like the FARC? They have women as part of the peace process, as part of the negotiation process, because they realize the key role women have in that organization, and they need to be included in the negotiation process. We need to consider both male and females as threats on the battlefield and do more to counter and prevent women versus just the male population. Let's look at the full context when we're analyzing the problem, not just the 49% of the population. Look at the 51% as well.
Thank you very much. And Colonel Meeker is going to talk about some of the existential angst that is driving ISIS recruitment in the United States.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. McCants. As I've said, a big fan of your work, and as Tracy said, very happy to have an expert here on the panel. And it is quite an honor to be on this prestigious platform here at Brookings, and happy 100th anniversary. I love what General Allen said earlier about fellowships, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be a fellow on behalf of the United States Army here in our nation's capital. I'm just grateful to be an American where we train our officers at every rank. We make education a priority. That's so important because what our officers do on the battlefield, is paid in the price of the blood of our young men and women. And so I'm grateful that our nation would make that investment, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. It's such a rich area here to be in Washington, to be a fellow at the Institute of World Politics. And as General Allen said, it's a great time to think deeply about difficult and complicated issues that are facing our nation. And so my prayer has been this year that I might be able to think deeply about issues that are impacting our military, our country, and our world. And so some of this hopefully will be a humble offering to help bring some solutions to these difficult days that we face. It's one thing to be perhaps a pundit. I've heard a lot of pundits this year. Pundits, I think, describe complicated and complex issues, but leaders say, yes, it's complicated, but here's a solution, and let's go. So at the end of the day, it's let's go. Let's make this world a better place. And so in 2014, there were 9 arrests in the U.S. for those who were supporting ISIL. Tracy talked about the foreign fighters. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our domestic fighters. In the past year, in 2015, that increased 5-fold from 9 in 2014 to nearly 50 arrests in the United States. Not a large number, but the increase, the uptick, certainly was concerning to me as I was looking at this, and certainly the attacks that happened in our country last year were very concerning. One thing to think about, economic disparity, unemployment issues, what humanitarian aid can we bring to a situation? It's another thing to think about, why would someone come from relative affluence, decide not to go to a foreign country to fight, but would fight here against fellow Americans? What's going on? Is there something more to this that we haven't looked at? Is this issue deeper than perhaps we've looked at? Peter Bergen said on Capitol Hill in November at a hearing on Homeland Security that homegrown terrorists are our #1 threat. James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, said just a few weeks ago when he gave his global assessment pretty much the same thing, that the homegrown terrorists is our top priority. It's our top threat here in the United States. So what is going on? Is there something more? Are we missing something in this fight? And so I think as I've looked at this, I think Daesh taps into the existential nature of what it means to be a human being. They clearly articulate their purpose, what they mean. And this speaks to people who are looking for a purpose greater than themselves. They want to make a difference. They want to be a part of history. They want to make an impact. And so when Dash speaks of these things, it taps into something very innate part of each of us. The world is facing a war of beliefs. This is a battle for the soul. It's not about economic opportunity or catchy phrases or slick promotions. It's about knowing the why of life. When Dash taps into this innate desire for meaning, purpose, and community, of course, they're doing it in a perverted way. But when a person commits to it, it becomes very brutal and very evil. This is what makes Dash so dangerous. Honor is in jihad, declares their English propaganda video from last June. Dash offers jihad to destroy the depravity of the West. Taqwa, the ascetic life, is a balm to Western indulgence, sacrifice, the cure to Western gratification, and piety, an alternative to Western immorality. Dash seduces recruits with a sense of belonging to a larger community, the Ummah, and guarantees eternal paradise. The U.S. response to this, to me, seems to fall short. An ex-terrorist was interviewed by CNN last fall. He called the Department of State message, "Think again, turn away," not only ineffective, but counter-effective. The most viewed Department of State video, "Welcome to the Islamic State," viewed by nearly a million views on YouTube, shows the savagery, the brutality of Daesh, their beheadings and humiliations. And the last frame, "Think again, turn away," is disappointing considering what could have been, I think, a powerful climax. Defend freedom, defeat Daesh. Think again, turn away, to me almost seems like, well, it's really bad and it's really evil. Turn away from that. Don't look at that. Maybe denial or ignoring it. I think we need to say what it is. We need to not turn away, but look at it closely. We need to face it and face it down. A Department of the Army's recent recruiting video on GoArmy.com entitled "U.S. Army Prepared for Anything" shows employment opportunities available in the Army, ending with a team with one simple mission: win. Soldiers are asked to forego their civilian comforts for the rigors of military training to deploy anywhere in the world to defeat evil, putting their very lives at risk. The Army should say what it truly is: one tough mission: defend freedom with your life. I have full confidence in the young men and women of our country. They are the most informed generation of all of history. They're smart, they're talented, and I believe that we should speak to them for the purpose which we as a country need for them to fulfill, and that is to defend our nation's freedom. They know the threat is real. Many of our young Americans were in grade school when 9/11 happened. So I think we should call them to this higher purpose. Daesh is in a perverted way. There is no other nation or nation state that can provide purpose like the United States of America. America is far from perfect. We have many foibles and faults, but our ideals of the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness remain ideals worth living for and dying for if necessary. It is a battle for the soul, and I am fully confident that our country will win this day. I look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I have a ton of questions. I don't want to monopolize, but I'll take my moderator's prerogative to ask a few, and I will proceed down the list in order. Colonel Onifer, I wanted to start by just asking you a question about the data. I've worked a lot on foreign fighters myself. The data is not great, either inside or outside the government. It is a very important data set to have because it can answer a lot of our questions about what can be done in terms of addressing structural factors or others. But the data is pretty poor. Can you speak to that?
Yes, mostly I can speak with respect to Syria, having worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, and it was pretty amazing how much of a black hole it was out there. I remember the analysts talking a lot about how even if there was some inkling that somebody was traveling to Syria, once they got in country, you have no idea what they did. Did they join al-Nusra Front? Did they join one of the moderate opposition groups? Did they join ISIL? As much as they had known at that point is that they traveled. And I mean, even, what we have seen over the past several months, of course, is because of the international problem. I would say there has been an improvement, at least in information sharing amongst the U.S. and a lot of the other countries who are either most effective or have a lot of travelers, but even that isn't perfect. I remember examples where, we would get lists of suspected travelers from another country, but these lists were, they don't know when the person may have gone, if the person had already returned, whether they were killed. So these were usually expired data, for lack of a better term. So that's part of the reason why you see, in the media, the numbers just keep going up and up and up. I do have to caveat that, and this is something that the intelligence community is trying to get across, is that when they say that all these people have traveled, that is a cumulative over time. It does not take into account those that are known to have been dead, those that are known to return. So it's hard to get an impression of how we are actually doing against foreign fighters when all you have is a cumulative number. But yes, the data is very hard to track, to know what's going on, and makes it a lot harder to prosecute the overall attempt to stem the flow in foreign fighters.
And we think that ISIS in Syria and Iraq has gotten the lion's share of the foreign fighters. And why do you think that's the case, right? There's hundreds of groups that are fighting. A number of them are jihadist groups. A number of those jihadist groups speak the same language as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Why is it that ISIS has been able to grab most of the market share?
Right. I would say more towards the beginning, so starting 2012, that it wasn't necessarily ISIS. At this point, they were still referred to as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and al-Sham, and there wasn't that seismic split yet between the Al-Qaeda groups where ISIS decided to forge on their own. So during those times from 2012 till June 2014, it really wasn't known what groups the folks were joining. But of course, as soon as ISIL started their what I call "Let's Take Over the World" campaign, June of 2014, the overrunning of Mosul, and just seemingly coming out of nowhere, building up their huge media presence and getting their message out. That's what they've done. They've got their message out so much better than any other group prior to them. And I think that's why we're seeing so many people going to go over and join again, like I said, this notion of the utopian caliphate.
Right, and they're winning, right? They have a big chunk of territory to go with this slogan they're preaching. That brings me to my final question for you, and that it has to do with the way we talk about our own campaign against the Islamic State. You made a point, which I strongly agree with, that we don't talk about our own effort very well. I have some of my own suspicions about why we do that, and I think it has to do with politics, but also the nature of the bureaucracy. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about why we don't do as well. On the Pentagon's website, there is a web page with a raw count of sorties flown and very bland descriptions of the kinds of targets hit. It doesn't give you any sense day to day why we're doing what we're doing. And on the ISIS side, they are very clear about where they're hitting and always explaining why they're hitting it. Why do you think we're not very good at talking to the public, particularly in comparison to, say, the first Gulf War?
Right. That's a very good question, and I wish I had a good answer for it. I am a big supporter of what is currently the U.S. government's counter-ISIL strategy, and of course the best person to talk to that was our guest speaker first thing this morning, General Allen, because he was the U.S. face of the counter-ISIL strategy, working with the coalition of all the other countries. And what people don't seem to realize is that this is a strategy of patience, and it's built to take that long-term view of, not trying to go in with a large military contingent to just try and either annihilate or kill a lot of ISIL members, but looking at, since that hasn't worked before, what can we do? So there's the line of effort against foreign fighters. There's the counter-propaganda line of effort, which I think pretty much anybody can admit is failing. There's the counter-finance line of effort, which I would say is actually doing pretty good. One positive story that you've seen come out lately is the effect that we're having on ISIL's finances, blowing up their banks, like literally millions of dollars just blowing up, going after their oil infrastructure, which is a main source of their money. There were stories in the news recently about how ISIL had to send out a memo to their fighters, hey guys, sorry, we're not doing so good, so you're all gonna have to take a half pay cut. That's great news, and again, that's the kind of thing that needs to get out there more, but I wish I knew why we weren't doing better in the dissemination of information. Like I said, it would be nice if we could match them, have our own media wing, for lack of a better term, to get our information and get our partners' information out there. But like I said, until we're willing to do that, I think we're constantly going to be behind the curve.
Okay, thank you. Colonel Turner, I agree with you that the media is biased in really strange ways when it reports about women who get involved, but particularly with Islamist terror groups. And I wonder if you share this perspective. My sense is that when the media talks about more secular or leftist terror groups or insurgencies, you don't see the bias quite as strongly. And my sense is it tends to clump around the Islamist variety because women are usually not as active on the battlefield or as suicide bombers. And I see two ways that this bias comes out, and please check me if I'm wrong, but you have two almost mirror image kind of ways of describing women. On the one hand, you have the Black Widow and the femme fatale, the title of your article, right? You have a woman who is cunning, who has tricked her man into fighting, is really the backbone of the organization. And then conversely, you also have women described as passive dupes, as you said in your presentation, that are always tricked into fighting. And the reality is, neither one of these is usually the case, right? They are usually getting involved for many of the same reasons as the men do and are just as motivated. Can you talk about some of the different ways the media describes women? Do you think this has anything to do with their limited role in Islamist groups, or do you think this same bias comes out when you talk about women in more secular or leftist groups?
Well, I definitely think based on the group and the leadership and the culture of the group, it's going to depend on how they use the women. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the Chechens with the Black Widows, they were pretty upfront. In the first war with Russia, they didn't use women in that way with suicide bombers. But then the second war, the leader threatened, well, we're going to use women suicide bombers. And no one thought they were going to do it because of the Wahhabism, Islam. Well, they need special permission to do that. Well, no, he said he was going to do it, and he did it. And it was because of the strategic needs. So if the group sees a strategic need against their adversary or the government they feel is oppressing them or whoever their enemy is, they're going to use women or their fighters how they need to win on the battlefield. And that's what the Black Widows did. Mm-hmm. The Russians tried to explain it away, saying the women are drugged, they're mentally, they're psychotic, right. They don't know what they're doing. When some of the women maybe were drugged, but majority of women volunteered because of the culture, because of what the Russians did to their families. They decimated the male population. So it depends on the group, and if they choose from a strategic perspective to do it, they're going to do it. I mean, if you look at Boko Haram right now,
Right.
they are using women. Now, there is the debate.
As suicide bombers?
As suicide bombers. But the debate is, do the women really know that they have a vest on? Do they really know the package they're delivering is a bomb? I mean, you're talking young girls I've seen from 11, 15, 13 into their late teens, early 20s as suicide bombers. Do they really know what they're doing? So, but that group and their background, and they're using women because it's targeting the Nigerian government, targeting the Nigerian military, and it fits their strategic purpose. And a lot of times when groups decide to use female suicide bombers, it's the tactical advantage.
Right.
Women can get to the location over men. They can pass through security more easily. They can hide things in their clothing. They can pose as pregnant. So that's how a lot of female suicide bombers are used for that purpose.
Right, because of the pre-existing gender bias that
Right.
women aren't going to be carrying out these
Women
attacks.
are nurturers, they're caregivers, they're kind, they're loving. When you look at men, they're the warriors, the active participant, they're the violent ones. So I think it's our own societal, it's our cultural biases, not just the media's bias that kind of leads us down that road. But also when you look at female suicide bombers, if the group really wants to achieve that psychological advantage could be on the population at home, could be on the adversary, I mean, they're going to use that tactic, and that's the suicide bomber, it's the female.
Right.
And that's why a lot of groups chose to do that. So that's just the varying different reasons.
One question I'm often asked, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is why women who are born and raised in the West decide to sign up for an organization like ISIS, which has been using systematic rape against women they consider to be unbelievers, Muslim women. You know, the desired role for them in the ISIS world is to be a homemaker, in the first instance to be the wife of a fighter and to bear a child for that fighter. Why would women who grow up in the West, where they have many more freedoms of movement, why would they deliberately and willingly travel to be part of the Islamic State organization?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, look at the age group of the women that are also going and volunteering from the West to be part of ISIL. They're searching for their identities. They don't know they're trying to figure out, what do I want to be? Think about when you were their age. What do I want to be when I grow up? What do I see my future as? I'm not happy with where I am right now. So if someone offers you something better than how you feel, whether you're poorly educated or can't decide where you want to go, and someone else says, well, here's a ticket, here's a plane ticket, here's a beautiful home, here's the role that we see that we need you to do, you're important to us, then they're going to want to do that. And then, of course, when they get over there, it's obviously the reality hits, and it's different than what they were told they were going to be doing. But if, they're targeting a rich population of young people that just, they're not happy, and we should be looking at the why behind that. What makes people so unhappy, or the youth or that targeted population so unhappy that they're willing to give everything up over here to go over there?
Right. I think that's a great point and a great segue to Colonel Meeker. You talk about kind of this existential void that is being filled by organizations like ISIS, and I think you've put your finger on something that's really important. The appeal of ISIS is often described as, they are Islamic, and they are putting themselves out there as Islamic. And that is certainly true. They describe their mission in those terms. They draw on Islamic history and scripture. But they are doing all of that to try and provide meaning and purpose. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about why youth in the West would be feeling this way. Is this just what comes along with being a youth in all times and all places, or is it something about this particular moment that might make youth open to this kind of group? And also, what is it that ISIS does that's skillful at tapping into that. I mean, it's dangerous to join an organization like ISIS. It's bad for your health. There is widespread opprobrium and dislike for the group, and yet you have some young people who are willing to go against the wishes of their parents, to risk imprisonment, and to try and either go join abroad or to do something at home. How is ISIS able to tap into that feeling of being lost and looking for one's place in the world?
That's a great question, and I think, to answer that answers a lot. In our culture, some of the issues that Kathy talked about with women and how we think of women culturally, I think also how we think and talk about religion in our culture is also important to acknowledge. It's not polite to talk about politics or religion, right? And yet, really, these are religious issues. If we talk about existential issues, we're talking about religious issues, because religion talks about and answers questions of why are we here, talks about purpose. And so our American reluctance to talk about the existential nature of this conflict is advantageous to our enemy, because they are directly talking about these issues. The youth are particularly vulnerable to this. The Department of State campaign, Think Again, Turn Away, seems very passive. If you're a young person or a person who is looking for purpose, looking for action, that's a disappointing campaign. On the other hand, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, they say, come be a part of us. We are making history right now. And so, I think our culture and not wanting to talk about the heart of the matter, which is a matter of the heart, makes us vulnerable to what the enemy is taking advantage of on the battlefield, around the world, and in our own country.
There's also a line of argument that's being developed in France that there's a widespread feeling of exhaustion in the West and no longer a desire to really fight for its values. So aside from just the religious question and answering life's big questions, it's also answering a nation's big questions. What do we stand for? Where are we going? What is this order that we're fighting for? And this seems in some ways to be a product of the post-Cold War world, a sense that, the West won, but it has grown lazy and tired. Do you agree with that kind of critique? Do you think that the West just doesn't know what it's fighting for anymore? And even if it did, would that resonate with young people? I mean, does anybody get out in the street and get fired up about multiculturalism and the liberal international order? I mean, can we ever compete with the kind of meaning, as a government, can we compete with the kind of meaning that is being offered by ISIS, which is promising to be the return of God's kingdom on earth?
Absolutely, Will. I really sense a great passion and conviction from our young men and women, millennials as they're called. They do care deeply about things that are going on in our world, about the climate, about economic disparity, about freedoms. They care very deeply, and they're just looking for that place to plug in. And as a country, we have places to plug in, whether it's the military, whether it's government service, whether it's education, whether it's good businesses and corporations. We need to dust off our ideals and remember who we are as a country, and call all citizens who are able-bodied and able-minded to take responsibility for our national security. It's not just about the 1%, where's Colonel Huggins, the 1% of those who serve in uniform in our military today. I take a very broad approach to our national security, and I believe that all Americans have responsibility to care for their homes, our communities. It all starts there, and to let our young people know what this country stands for and that we need their help right now. They're smart. They have the solutions. They have the energy to lead us through. Every generation is responsible for our freedom, for this nation continuing. It's their time now, and I think we need to call them and be very clear about what we're calling them to.
All right, thank you. Let's throw it open for some questions. I will take 3 of them because time is short, and we'll come back to the panel. Yes, sir, in the cap here. And there's a microphone somewhere that's going to come to you, so if you could hold your question for a sec.
Thank you very much, everyone on the panel. I'm Elliot Hurwitz. I was a former State Department official, World Bank contractor, and intelligence community contractor. This question was raised on the panel, but I'd like to pose it again. What's causing domestic terrorists to attack U.S. interests?
Thank you. All right, and let's take another one. There in the very back, blue shirt, brown tie.
Thank you very much for your comments. I got in a little late. Appreciate everything you're talking about. I'm Lauren Hershey, formerly with the Department of Justice, and fortunately or unfortunately a Fulbrighter in India quite some time ago, about 48 years ago. So I think about all these issues as you think about them. My focus question is, doesn't this country need a non-military route to public service for a couple of years when you graduate high school or you graduate college? Wouldn't that help take up the slack, so to speak, that you're referring to? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's have one more there on the right. Yeah. I'm sorry. My left. Yes. Right there. Yep.
Hi, I'm Toby Harshaw. I'm an editor with Bloomberg View. J.M. Berger, who was with Brookings until very recently, did a study on the effectiveness of Twitter in banning ISIS accounts. Colonel Onifer, I'm wondering if you think, A, that there really has been some success in that, and whether that's actually a good idea, if censorship of ISIS's message is the best way of fighting ISIS, and whether we shouldn't just be trying to put out a better message of our own.
All right, let's take those, and if we've got some more time, I'll come back around again. So we've got 3 questions. We've got one about terrorists attacking domestically. Why are they doing it? Another question about non-military route for national service, and then this one directed to Colonel Onifer. Has Twitter been successful at suppression? So Colonel Meeker, how about you tackle the question of why terrorists are attacking domestically? I mean, why not travel overseas? Why do this here at home?
That's a good question. The way I understand it is that once committed to this cause, once committed to the Islamic State, they're taking their directives in general, may not be person to person, but in general to attack here in the United States, to attack targets, to kill as many as possible, to inflict as much harm and damage and suffering right here in the United States. So Dr. Tawfir Hamid, author of Inside Jihad, he was radicalized. He talks about this process of radicalization. He has a Facebook page in Arabic, and I believe these kinds of sites and information are very helpful for young Americans or all Americans who may be considering this ideology to look at his work and see how that process of radicalization happens and how someone can be manipulated so that we can reverse this trend.
I want to throw the question about non-military service out to all of you. It wasn't your career paths, right? So I don't know how well you can speak to it. But if you have any ideas, my sense is there are a variety of avenues, but there's, for example, Peace Corps, but there's no one obvious avenue, or to my knowledge, no central agency that one could apply to and then look to place you in different sorts of initiatives. Thoughts?
Well, I'll just throw myself in there, Will. But I think the idea of non-military service is very important, and I encourage that. You know, all of us here have 20 plus years apiece of military service, and that's just the path that we chose to take. But being the mother of three, I fully encourage our children to give back and be a good citizen, and I think non-military service, some sort of public service after high school, is a way to do that, whether it be the Peace Corps, whether it be through some other type of agency where you are contributing back to society and doing your part to make sure that globally we become a better and peaceful society, so that we, you know, care for one another and treat people with respect. And whether it's the military, Peace Corps, I mean, you know, Girl Scout, all those different things that you lead up to when you graduate high school, I think that's important.
All right, and the question about Twitter and whether the suppression campaign is working, and is it, you know, philosophically a good idea?
Right. No, I don't think it's working. And I've heard it referred to as kind of the whack-a-mole theory, where, you know, you shut down one account, but I mean, that person's more than likely just going to start up another account. And I do think that there is intelligence that you can gather, or just information, I should say, is probably a better word, from those accounts. So I don't know that wholesale shutting them down is necessarily the right route, but absolutely agree with you. You know, a better either counter campaign or way to engage the folks who are putting that out there, I think would make more sense than just straight shutting them down.
All right, let's quickly take three more and then we'll wrap. Zach here in the front. Wait for the mic. You know the drill.
Thanks. Zach Gold with the Atlantic Council. Colonel Onifer, I guess building on that Twitter and gaining intelligence and information, how much, when we're looking at the millennial jihadis, is the millennial tools, are the millennial tools helpful in actually identifying them when they're posting on Facebook, hey, here I am in Raqqa, and helping to find and counter them when they return? Thank you.
All right. More? Yes, ma'am. Please, here in the blue jacket. Wait for the mic. Yes, please.
Veronica Cartier, if I may give my slightly few of my experience that I affiliated with the Muslim state of Indonesia.
Can it be in the form of a question?
Yes,
Okay.
then follow with the strong
All
question.
right. And I'm mindful of the time,
Yeah,
too.
sure.
Please.
I quite agree. Dialogue is so crucial. Communication between the West and the Muslim. And it is not a radical faith that we're looking at, but also we have to consider, quote, economic disparity, and also exhaustion, frustration, not understanding what to expect from the West. So that, the change of global political landscape as transitioning to democracy. And I think American has been assisting other countries for democratic governance. Now my question is, what kind of impact that United States in regard to Muslim state after United States effort for democratic governance?
All right, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And one more, please, in the green sweater right there. Yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm actually from the UK, so coming from a more nuanced perspective, I think if we take the West as a collective, we're looking at capitalism as our common denominator. So when looking at capitalism, we draw our meaning for life through that particular theory or activity, if you like. So as a result, the UK is also struggling for a narrative, a counter-narrative. So when it comes to meaning, what can we offer through capitalism as our daily activity to counteract this particular message which is going out. The sole purpose of our live daily activity is in capitalism. So what does capitalism actually offer us? And is there a deeper meaning within the concept of capitalism?
All right, thank you very much. 3 great provocative questions. I'll throw it open to the group. If you could keep your remarks short, and we will wrap afterwards. So just to remind you, millennials and how useful they can be in the fight against ISIS. There was a question about structural factors and a mention of democracy. I'd put it slightly differently. There was a great enthusiasm for democratic transition in the Middle East in 2011. Should we be as excited to see new revolutions break out, or has our enthusiasm been justly tempered given the events over the past few years? And also, money, capitalism, what is it good for? What kind of meaning can we possibly derive when our lives are focused on a consumer economy? So, Colonel Onifer, I'll start with you. You can take a stab at any of those, and we'll move down the line.
For the millennial jihadists, I would say that they're very smart, and for the most part, they're hiding what they're doing. Their profiles are not public necessarily. They're using the secure apps. In fact, that's one of the biggest gripes of the Intel community, is that we just can't see, we can't follow them, we don't know what they're talking about, we don't know what they're going. But I will say that there are instances, if they are stupid and have something that we can, that is posted for public consumption, there is the way to use that for benefit.
All right, Colonel Turner, you want to take a stab at any of those?
I guess I'll try the economic disparity, the democratic.
There you go.
Okay. So I think we need to continue to encourage democratic growth, especially for countries that are not like us. I think we need to be very careful if we seem to be arrogant or our way is the only way. And so we need to be helpful, but we need to let those other countries do it in their own way and lend support where we can. And we need to make sure that we're listening to what they say they want and don't overstep, because that's been a large part of the problem, is that we're overstepping and we're not letting countries figure it out on their own. And we're kind of trying to dominate that. And so I think we need to be listen more, need to be more inclusive and kind of help countries do that in that way.
And Colonel Meeker, you want to take a stab at any of those?
I would say capitalism shouldn't be about the money. It should be about being an entrepreneur, having equal opportunity, creating prosperity for all.
All right, thank you very much. And join me in thanking our panel for a great session.